à cette table ronde sur le thème des attaques de la part des mouvements anti-droit à l'universalité des droits humains. Je suis ravie d'être ici en présence de spécialistes du sujet. Est-ce que... Alice, est-ce que du coup, Karima elle va. Ok. Donc je me trouve en présence de Nail Data. Nail qui a fondé le Forum parlementaire européen pour les droits sexuels et reproductifs en 2000, avec un groupe de parlementaires et avec le soutien de l'IPPF, qui est l'International Planned Parenthood Federation. Vous en êtes toujours le directeur aujourd'hui. Vous avez contribué à la croissance du forum, qui compte aujourd'hui plus de 30 groupes parlementaires multipartites sur les questions de population et de développement. Vous avez plus de 15 ans d'expérience dans le domaine de l'engagement politique en matière de population et de développement. Tout au long de cette période, vous avez mené des recherches approfondies sur les activités anti-choix en Europe, sur les lobbies aussi ultra-catholiques qui prônent notamment la restauration de l'ordre naturel et le retour aux valeurs traditionnelles. À ses côtés, Anthéa Taderera. Vous êtes une avocate spécialisée dans la théorie juridique et politique féministe et dans son application à la création de mouvements et au leadership féministe. Vous êtes membre de Coalition of African Lesbians. Vous êtes spécialisée dans les droits sexuels et vous travaillez actuellement comme conseillère en plaidoyer pour Sexual Rights Initiative, sur les droits liés au genre et à la sexualité dans le domaine international des droits humains, en particulier dans le cadre de l'examen périodique universel et du Conseil des droits de l'homme. À vos côtés, Camila, Maia. Vous êtes juriste titulaire d'un diplôme en relations internationales de l'Université de Brasilia, également titulaire d'un master en politique publique de la Fondation Getúlio Vargas. Vous êtes basé en Argentine depuis 2010. Vous êtes membre du Centro de Estudios Legales y Sociales, où vous coordonnez actuellement le droit international. Vous avez participé à de nombreux processus de plaidoyer régionaux et internationaux sur des questions relatives aux droits humains, notamment la politique migratoire, le droit de manifester, le logement, les droits fonciers, la politique fiscale et la dette. Et avec nous en duplex, Karima Bennoune. Bonjour à vous. Vous êtes professeur de droit à la faculté de droit de l'Université du Michigan, où vous enseignez le droit international et les droits humains. Vous avez occupé le poste de rapporteur spécial des Nations Unies dans le domaine des droits culturels de 2015 à 2021. Vous avez également été nommée experte pour la Cour pénale internationale en 2017 lors de la phase de réparation d'une affaire inédite, le procureur C. Ahmad Al-Fay Al-Mahdi concernant la destruction intentionnelle de sites du patrimoine culturel au Mali. Vous êtes ancienne conseillère juridique d'Amnesty International. Vous avez effectué des missions de défense des droits humains dans la plupart des régions du monde et vous êtes l'autrice de Votre fatwa ne s'applique pas ici, un livre dans lequel vous dressez le portrait d'opposants et d'opposantes aux fondamentalistes islamistes dans des pays comme le Pakistan, l'Afghanistan, l'Algérie, l'Égypte, la Tunisie, l'Iran, le Mali et la Tchétchénie. On va commencer tout de suite avec vous d'ailleurs, Karima, parce que je crois que vous pouvez hélas pas être très longtemps en notre compagnie. Ma première question, c'est: vous avez été rapporteuse spéciale auprès des Nations Unies pour les droits culturels. Avez-vous pu observer les attaques de ces mouvements à l'universalité des droits humains? Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire déjà l'universalité des droits humains pour que tout le monde comprenne? Et est-ce que vous pourriez nous parler un peu de leur rhétorique?
Thank you very much. Bonjour. Can you hear me? I'm hoping you can hear me, so I will proceed. I wish very much that I could be with you today, and I would like to congratulate the FIDH for its anniversary. And I want to thank you for organizing this particular discussion, which I think is so critical to have in this moment. Let me say first that I think the universality of human rights really goes to the heart of the whole human rights project and really of who we are as human beings, which makes attacks on the idea of universality very dangerous. I think what I said in my report to the General Assembly in 2018 for the, at that time, 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was that the universality of human rights was one of the most important principles codified in international law in the 20th century. And in practice, what we see is that it's a critical tool in the toolbox of human rights defenders around the world, and it's a critical tool in the UN human rights system and the regional human rights systems as well. But what we see when we look around the world, when we participate in international fora, is that universality is also under attack, but it has ardent defenders in all regions of the world, and its opponents are also geographically diverse. And I think it's important to really pay attention to this. Universality is under attack from many directions at the same time, including from some governments, very openly, for example, in UN debates. It is under attack from some, both on the political right and on the political left. It is under attack sometimes from non-state actors, including especially diverse fundamentalists, extremists, populists, again, around the world in different regions. And even, I'm sorry to say, as a professor, it is sometimes under attack from within academia. And what we see is that many of these attacks misuse culture and cultural rights. And so because I was the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights for 6 years, as you mentioned, this was something to which I had to pay a great deal of attention. I remember back when I was Special Rapporteur, the person who was at that time the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and this was Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, in his last speech to the UN Human Rights Council, in 2018, he asked a question very relevant for us, which is, why is the Universal Declaration and human rights law itself subject to so much attack? And he attributed these attacks, including on universality, to what he called the instrumentalization of history, to political self-interest, and narrow-minded nationalism. And I think, unfortunately, these are also parts of the motivation for the attacks that we're continuing to see today. And at that time, back in 2018, he actually appealed to the members of the UN Human Rights Council, so states, as well as to human rights advocates and humanity generally, to speak louder and work harder, as he said, for the common purpose and for universal human rights law. And really, he stressed that this universal human rights ideal has been what he called the most constructive movement of ideas in our era. And I think today, as we're approaching the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration next year, we really have to heed his appeal from 2018. So I think in view of the attacks, we need a foundational renewal of universality, which looks back at the key standards and achievements of the Universal Human Rights Framework, but also looks forward with a broad youth constituency. And I think to do this, we have to understand the attacks, and this takes me back to the question. So many of the attacks that we're seeing on the universality of rights are based on cultural relativism, which is a doctrine that has been really repudiated by international human rights law. And that international human rights law that repudiates cultural relativism, that rejects it, that human rights law has been codified by governments from every region in the world. But we see these cultural relativist arguments being advanced that suggest that some people have lesser or different rights because of the groups to which they are assumed to belong. The other interesting thing we see is that almost no one relativizes their own rights. People usually relativize the rights of others. And we see these kinds of cultural relativist arguments being raised by governments in UN debates. We see them in university classrooms and even textbooks, sometimes in the field of human rights. This has been a matter of great concern to me. And we see sometimes both that apologists for colonialism, but also some people who consider themselves post-colonial are making some similar cultural relativist justifications and arguments sometimes. And I think all of this has to be tackled through very creative, fully resourced human rights education. Because what I said as Special Rapporteur is that cultural relativism is not just a theoretical construct. It actually creates exclusions from human rights protection that can lead to very grave and sometimes lethal consequences. And I was very disturbed while I was Special Rapporteur to see the way in which people use the concept of culture, which is such an important part of human existence and indeed of human rights, but this concept of culture is misused as a trope for cultural relativism in many debates. And so I felt it was very important to me to constantly be responding to this discourse as a Special Rapporteur, and in particular to respond to attempts to use what were called traditional values. And we see certain governments, including the Russian government, very attached to this idea of what they call traditional values without defining what those values might be. But we also see some other language, protection of the family. This comes up a great deal with regard to women's human rights and sexual and reproductive rights in particular. We also see language in some UN resolutions even referring to what are called sensitivities and the need to respect historical, cultural, social, and religious sensitivities. So a number of different discourses all seeking to introduce cultural relativism, including into UN debates. And so throughout the time that I was Special Rapporteur, what I tried to do was to vigorously defend universal cultural rights, including the right to take part in cultural life without discrimination, but to always make clear what cultural rights are not. Cultural rights are not the same thing as cultural relativism. They are not an excuse for violations of other human rights. They do not justify discrimination or violence. They are actually firmly embedded in the universal human rights framework. And it seems to me that these are some of the critical messages that we should all be taking forward at this very polarized time. So thank you for the question.
Merci à vous. Dans votre livre, votre fatwa ne s'applique pas ici, écrit à titre personnel. Vous faites le portrait de femmes et d'hommes qui luttent contre le fondamentalisme islamiste, notamment par la culture, par le biais de la culture, et vous pointez leur solitude du fait du peu de soutien international. Comment parvenir à soutenir ces résistances selon vous ?
The book, although it may be coming up backwards on the screen, it's also available in French. It has been translated into French. And in this book, I interviewed about 300 people from more than 30 countries, from Afghanistan to Mali. So these were Muslims and people of Muslim heritage who were working against fundamentalism and extremism. And what I wanted to do was to create more support for them internationally. And in writing the book, I was really inspired by the experiences of my own father in Algeria, who was a university professor. And like so many Algerian civil society activists, women's rights activists, journalists, and others, was very vocal in speaking out against extremism back in the 1990s. But what we saw is that the international community didn't really listen to the opponents of extremism. It paid much more attention to the extremists and the terrorists themselves, and they were well known internationally, but the opponents were not. So I was trying to change that equation a bit by writing this book, Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here. And what I would say is, I think this connects to the last question that you asked me, some of the most ardent defenders of universal human rights in the world are located in these regions which I visited. And this project of pushing back against fundamentalism, which is happening in many different contexts in the world today, is also really a project about demanding universal rights and rejecting sort of Islamic exceptionalist arguments that are a form of cultural relativist arguments. And I think about some of the people I had the honor of interviewing whose work is very relevant today, such as Roya Boramand, who heads the Abdurrahman Boramand Foundation. She's Iranian. Her father was an Iranian activist trying to document human rights violations inside the Islamic Republic, and he was actually assassinated in exile in Paris, it is believed, by agents sent by the Iranian government. And she today, in his memory, created a foundation and continues to document killings and other violations by the Iranian state. Or I think about somebody like Asia Amini, who is an Iranian journalist who campaigned against the use of the horrible, cruel punishment of stoning in Iran. She is also today in exile. So what do we need to do to support the people who are doing this work? I think many things. They need thoughtful, and I really stress thoughtful, transnational support. Very often the extremists themselves do have those transnational networks and sources of resources and so on. We need to give these opponents of extremism the microphone so that their voices are heard loud and clear. We need to translate what they write, sometimes in other languages, and we're all living, I think, in the world, whether in English or in French, but especially maybe in English, in language silos, and not listening to and not reading the very important work being done in other languages. So we need to do that. When these people, when it becomes too dangerous for them to be able to continue their work on the front lines, we need to make sure that they have asylum and they are able to continue their work elsewhere. And when I asked many of those I interviewed, you know, what do you need? What would support your work? Many of them said to me, support universal rights. They really recognized that the struggle to protect the notion of the universality of human rights and that it also applies in their contexts was a key part of the struggle against fundamentalism. So I think finding ways to really promote and support local civil society that understands its own contexts best in the work that it's already doing is one of the most important things that we can do, and really stand with people like those who are working for a change in Iran now and in so many other places. So thank you also for this question, and I'm so sorry that I have to leave. I wish you a wonderful forum and a really thoughtful and productive discussion here. Thank you.
Merci à vous. On va poursuivre avec vous, Neil, parce que vous êtes expert de ces mouvements anti-droit et anti-genre. J'ai un petit souci avec le casque, je suis navrée. Hop là. Vous êtes spécialiste de ces mouvements, vous avez rédigé plusieurs rapports sur cette nébuleuse, notamment un qui s'intéresse au financement. Est-ce que vous pourriez nous expliquer un petit peu comment ils se sont organisés, comment ils s'organisent, comment ça évolue depuis maintenant plusieurs années?
Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'll speak in English because I know this matter better in English. But thank you very much. I just want to start with a small preface by saying that even though I have looked at this issue now for the past, I think, almost 10 years, that's not my main job or what I really am meant to be doing. As Audrey mentioned, I work in the field of sexual reproductive health and rights, and specifically with politicians. And my primary objective is to improve policies in terms of sexual reproductive health and rights. So that's access to family planning, abortion rights, cervical cancer prevention, maternal health. And so looking at anti-gender fundamentalist organizations, it's something that we have been forced into doing over the past 10 years. And the way we got into doing this is mainly because about a bit more than 10 years ago, From our different national members all across Europe, we started getting an increasing number of calls saying, that the right to abortion or comprehensive sexuality education is being called into question in this and that country. And so from our European perspective, we started seeing similar things happening in Latvia, in Portugal, in France, in Ireland, and different places. And when we started putting all of this together, we noticed that in fact, we find the same organizations and individuals who are contesting these issues across many different countries in Europe. So we thought this is different. It's not the normal thing that we've been used to, where abortion rights, sexual reproductive rights have always been contested, and if you're working in that field, you're used to it. But this was something new that we were seeing. In the beginning, many people just thought, oh, this comes from the United States, which I understood later on was basically a shorthand for people saying this is well organized and sophisticated. It's not necessarily US American, but there was something new about this. So I'd like maybe to explain a little bit what's new about this through 5 main points, okay? From the basis of the research that we did when we compared all of these different things happening together, one of the first things we realized is that we're not dealing with the same contestation of difficult issues or controversial issues like abortion or sexuality as we are used to. What makes it different is, on the one hand, the actors are very different, and the mechanisms, the tools that they're different, are different. So what we noticed is that, there's a whole generation of new organizations, think tanks, NGOs, political parties that have emerged and then joined the fight in contesting women's rights, LGBT rights, abortion rights, even violence against women. So one is a whole new range of actors. Secondly, what we noticed was also that they had become extremely professionalized. So no longer were they just these random individuals who organize a protest in front of a family planning or abortion clinic. In France, you had here Xavier Dor, who would go in front of the planning and then throw fetuses at people or whatever. What we saw is a set of organizations that knew how political processes worked. They knew how the courts worked, and they were now engaging with that and being able to initiate certain things. Another aspect that we found was that professionalization, they were also very well networked transnationally. So on the one hand, they like to pretend that they're nice, cuddly Christians or parents groups organized at national level. That's very far from the truth. They are very professional, they are linked to elite groups, and they meet across different national borders. They plan, they strategize, they exchange. And one such group that we saw, and we were able to basically out them, was a secretive group called Agenda Europe, which had been meeting in what they call summits since 2013. And when we take a look at how it is that they were meeting, at first they were simply trying to be more relevant and try to plan how to really weigh in on society. By the second meeting in 2014, which took place in a castle owned by the Bishop of Munich, we saw that they were able to identify priority areas. By the third meeting, they had launched initiatives. So if you remember back to 2013, 2014, 2015, there was a whole range of traditional family/homophobic initiatives across many countries of Eastern Europe. They appeared in Croatia, Slovakia, Romania, Poland, more or less at the same time. That's not an accident. They were strategically conceptualized, and the national actors took them to their respective countries and launched them. And so that's one aspect of how it is that they were very strategic and professional. Another thing that we saw is that they were very ambitious. So far from simply trying to represent a religious point of view and to protect the values of the faithful, we had seen that this had now morphed into a political project and even a political power project. And then also the range of activities or issues that they were going to contest had vastly expanded. We're all familiar with the contestation around abortion, which has happened in almost every country where abortion has become legal. Then we started seeing that the same actors were taking up contesting LGBTQI rights. Then the next target became gender equality, gender mainstreaming, even gender-based violence, violence against women came to be contested. Another area was also children's rights, one that we often overlook, but specifically that nexus of decision-making between who has the last word in terms of the best interests of the child. Is it the parents within a certain family? And by family, what they mean is traditional, heterosexual, patriarchal family, or may the state intervene on behalf of the best interests of the child? Then also, a third aspect, fifth aspect, is really upholding the idea of religious freedom. Religious freedom is something we all support. What they mean specifically by religious freedom is the idea that my rights as a Christian are more important than your rights as an LGBT person or as a woman or some other category. So we saw that there had been a professionalization also in the narratives. So we saw that there's a whole category of human rights that are being contested, not just abortion, with a new set of actors. A third point also is the subject of a report that we released last year entitled Tip of the Iceberg, where basically the movement is much bigger than we had thought. What we did is we took a look at the finances behind these organizations, and only the ones active in Europe. So, we didn't bother looking at the US, Latin America, Africa, just the ones in Europe. And we identified over 120 such organizations active in campaigning against all the issues that I've mentioned: sexual reproductive health, LGBT, gender, children, etc. And what we found is we were only able to get the financials for less than half of them, 54 of them. But of that, for a 10-year period between 2009 and 18, we were able to calculate that there is a minimum of $700 million going into this movement contesting these human rights in Europe. And of that $700 million, we know that the annual amount quadrupled over that period, so that in 2009 it was approximately $20 million going into this contestation of socially conservative issues at the beginning. By 2018, it had reached almost $80 million just in Europe. And then when we take a look further, three main geographic sources appear. One is the US. So I mentioned the Americans at the very beginning. So we always knew they were there. So they are there. But of the 700 million, they only account for approximately 80-some million. Okay, so it's important, but they're not the big part. What's interesting with the US is that US funding is geared specifically towards professional legal organizations which are designed to which are specialized in litigation. So they are there to find cases and then bring them up through the national courts and up all the way up to the European Court of Human Rights. Second source is the Russian Federation, specifically two Russian oligarchs who are very, very far right, and they're so far right they were banned already in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, not even just now with what's happening in Ukraine. And they account for about 188 million. And the third source is Europe itself. That's the vast majority of funding, 437 million. And that comes from European social and economic elites, governments, astroturfing enterprises. And that's interesting because it shows that this anti-gender movement is primarily European funded. Maybe some other things, two more points I just want to add. So much bigger than we anticipated in terms of funding. Another thing that we've noticed is that it's no longer just about normative objectives in terms of women's health, LGBT rights, etc. What we see is that in order to meet their objectives, they're very willing to undermine the rule of law and democracy. And I think that's an important point to highlight. We see similar strategies taking place all over Europe, for example, of legal intimidation, so that when people speak out against these organizations and simply reveal them for what they are, they may face a lawsuit. So myself, I'm facing 2 or 3 lawsuits as a result of these reports. Different members of parliament that we work with are also facing legal lawsuits because they've spoken out publicly. But that's really nothing in comparison to, for example, what's happening in Poland, where I met with Marta Lempart. She's the head of the Polish women's strike, and she's been speaking out against these things. She's the one that organizes all the women's marches. I saw her in June of this year. She told me, Neil, I've just reached my 101st lawsuit against me. So you can see, when you see the same thing happening across many different borders, and it's the same organizations doing this, it's not an accident. It's really a strategy to intimidate people through litigation. Another strategy that we see them employing is that of infiltration. They try to become credible interlocutors with international bodies or national bodies, and then from that, they try to go inside those bodies. So that we know that, for example, the head of the Supreme Court of Poland is the founder of one of the organizations which are the most conservative in Poland, which are behind the abortion ban, the LGBT free zones, and attempts to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention. And just now, I was checking my emails the day before yesterday. It looks like there's a similar person in the government of Giorgia Meloni in Italy. So we see that they're able to reach very high levels through a strategy of infiltration. So I think that's a good introduction to it. So.
Oui. Peut-être juste un tout petit mot supplémentaire dans toutes ces stratégies dont vous parliez, sur la rhétorique qui est utilisée et sur la réappropriation de certains termes des droits humains qui renversent pour se réapproprier le vocabulaire des progressistes. Peut-être que vous pouvez en 2 mots expliquer un petit peu aussi cette stratégie.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things that we found was their own document, their own manifesto, which is entitled Restoring the Natural Order, this document was a treasure trove in understanding what their thinking is and their strategies. And in their own words, they outline their strategies. So one of the things that we can observe is a specific strategy to secularize language. So what's happened is they take old religious ideas which are against abortion, against contraception, against LGBT rights. They know that the religious argumentation doesn't work anymore, especially not in Europe. So what do when your ideas don't work? Well, then what they've done is to secularize them. So imagine a big washing machine. You put in old religious ideas, you put it through the washing machine, and out comes human rights sounding language that you can try to pass off in different international bodies and institutions. It doesn't stand the test of actual jurists, but it is good enough if you have willing politicians and who are willing to run with this and put their political stake behind this. So that's one thing that happened overall. Another thing that they did also was to come up with a few sub-strategies. One of them is to present themselves as victims. So instead of homophobia existing and LGBT people suffering from discrimination, homosexuality is itself a source of discrimination against Christians because Christians are forced to live in the world where there's gay people. This is an offense to their Christian faith and their Christian values. So becoming the new victims. Another strategy that they've employed is specifically to denigrate their opponents. So what they've done is really find strategies to go after the main organizations, such as the ones defending abortion or LGBT rights, and to tarnish and sully their reputation. We see this work having been developed very well in the United States and then exported to other places where they've tried to run with this. And then another one is to establish a contest of rights or a competition of rights so that women's rights or LGBT rights is put in competition with another set of rights, usually the right to religious freedom. And then the argument is that the right to religious freedom is of a higher order of rights that others should acquiesce to. So these are just some of the strategies that they're using.
Merci beaucoup. Anthéa, vous avez été membre de la coalition des lesbiennes africaines. Je vous laisse mettre votre casque.
Non, c'est bon.
C'est bon? Ok. La coalition des lesbiennes africaines avait le statut d'observateur auprès de la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples. Et elle a fait l'objet d'une campagne de dénigrement et d'une remise en cause de ces statuts, notamment en raison de la nécessité de la prise en compte des valeurs et traditions africaines, ce dont parlait Karima Bennoune tout à l'heure. Est-ce que vous pourriez nous expliquer un petit peu ce qui s'est passé, ce qui s'est tramé, quel était le contexte?
Thanks, Audrey. Yes, it is on. Okay, sorry. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for inviting us to speak. So the Coalition of African Lesbian Stories is a whole saga. So I'm going to try to make it as dramatic as possible so you can see yourself in the situation, okay? So it's a story that can be told in 3 acts and a prologue, and also some very serious issues. But you have to keep it fun. So the prologue is 2008. The Coalition of African Lesbians has applied for observer status for the first time. The African commissioners feel a little sick because they'd rather the Coalition of African Lesbians had not applied for observer status because now it's awkward. Now they have to decide whether or not they can have it. So they drag their feet for 2 years. Usually the process is pretty straightforward. You put in your documents at the next ordinary session. They say, yes, 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 all the documents are here. They do human rights, rubber stamp, you have your observer status. But they sat on it for 2 years, trying to figure out what to say. And then in 2010, they told us, well, CAL doesn't really work on human rights, does it? So this is a human rights body. We do human rights here, so no observer status for you. Fast forward, now it's 2014. CAL and its partners have been working to have a broader conversation on sexual and reproductive health and rights on the continent. So CAL's work is a little misleading because you'd think all we do is gay stuff all day, every day. Mostly, yes, but also we work on SRHR, or we worked, because I don't work for CAL anymore, on SRHR broadly, on access to contraception, on access to abortion, on the rights of sex workers, and basically on the right to bodily autonomy. So we spent the last 4-ish years trying to convince the African Commission that A, we're women, B, women have rights, and C, they should probably do something about these rights of these women that we are. And so the African Commission is convinced to adopt a resolution, Resolution 275, that is very, very, very narrowly worded, that's focused on the rights of sexual and gender minorities, and the right to be free from violence and discrimination. It's about 3 paragraphs, but those 3 paragraphs mean that CAL can show back up at the African Commission and say, now you work in those human rights, so we work in human rights. Can we have observer status? And it is tense. Can you feel the tension? It is tense because we've applied again. There is a whole public hearing about the observer status. The commissioners have to have a public vote about it. They are mad. They are giving really impassioned speeches. One commissioner says that homosexuals are the virus that has been sent by the West to divide Africans, and you're letting them do it. It's tense, okay? It's mad tense in this room. And so the commissioners vote. It's really close. It's 5-4 votes. We get the observer status. There's 2 abstentions. And we celebrate. And this is April 2015. In June 2015, the AU Executive Council says no, please. They issue decision 887, and they say, you know, we've seen your reports, these little reports that you have to submit to us, and we see that you have given this organization observer status, which is contrary to our good African values. You know, the bad African values might allow homosexuality, but never the good ones. It's against our good African values and traditions, and therefore we strongly suggest that you rescind this observer status. And so, like the good human rights activists we are, we run to the African court. because we want the African courts to say, it's not allowed. You can't interfere. You're not allowed to do this here. You're a political body. And this is a quasi-judicial body. It's independent. It's allowed to do what it wants. And it thinks that these are human rights and we are activists and we're allowed to occupy this political space. And so the case is kind of winding the African court. We've asked for an advisory opinion about the level of power, the level of influence the AU Executive Council is allowed to have over the African Commission. We're hoping that the court is going to say, no, this is like properly independent body, and you might be mad about it, but you're just going to have to live with it. That is not what they say. And so they dismiss our case. They say they cannot substantively hear it because we do not meet the criteria of an African organization that is working with the AU. And so we get the second AU decision, decision 1015. And in this decision, the AU says, like we said before, right? You need to get rid of this organization called CAL. Because of our good African values and traditions, but also you need to understand that you only have independence of a functional kind, and they proceed to list other ways in which the power of the African Commission and its independence is going to be curtailed, including their ability to set the standards of what kinds of NGOs will be permitted to have observer status, if and when such NGOs would lose this observer status, so they had to adopt the standards as accepted by the AU, and now a defining criteria for whether or not you can have observer status is whether or not it's consistent with these African values and traditions. And so let me be clear about something. CAL is a feminist organization, but it's also a Pan-Africanist organization. We're absolutely team decolonization. We believe that it's important to decolonize, to fully liberate all African people, and we really mean all women, all black women, all queer people, all trans people. And so for us, there's a contestation there about who is it that is permitted to define what our traditions are and what our culture is, right? So on the one hand, states are perceiving themselves as the sole possible custodians of African heritage. They think we're all the same. They think Africanness is homogenized, which is a bit of an anti-black and little racist view that we're just kind of reprojecting on ourselves. They think that because Africa has allegedly had a patriarchal past, has a patriarchal present, it must necessarily have a patriarchal future, or else we're not African anymore. And CAL and other African lesbians and feminists disagree completely. We think cultures belong to communities, that we have the right to participate in the cultural lives of our states, to participate in the evolution of that culture, and we have the right to state our opinions and to be heard. So from our vantage point, it is not, in fact, African traditions to subordinate women. That is just the patriarchy, right? And so states are selectively picking and choosing which traditions make it easier to subordinate women and to control us and to govern us and to keep us quiet, right? And so for African feminists, the assertion was, even us, we can read. Even us, we are part of communities. We also have thoughts about how our societies and communities should evolve, and also about which values we think are most important. Values like cooperation, the values that are contained in Ubuntu and Hunu, about gentleness, about caring for each other, about resource sharing, about ensuring that everybody is involved in decision making and not making it really difficult for SRHR feminists, for women in general, women full stop, to participate in these international spaces. And it was a really interesting and very cynical thing that member states did because they use the entire cow situation as a Trojan horse because they know that people are comfortable with heterosexism and homophobia. They know that they're comfortable with feminists and with women not having the right to bodily autonomy because you're told things like, you can have your rights later, bread and butter issues. And so they knew that if they pick on us and then they just like write the little theory to its logical conclusion, other CSOs would be slow to react and to realize that their status was also at risk, which is exactly what happened, right? They were willing to sacrifice us in order, ostensibly, to defend the system, and then they were complicit in helping to weaken it and possibly to dismantle it. We'll see. We'll see what happens in a few years.
Merci beaucoup, Anthéa. Camila, vous êtes brésilienne, vous travaillez en Argentine, mais vous êtes brésilienne. Le Brésil, dont le président, je le rappelle, en juin 2022, qualifiait d'inadmissible l'avortement d'une fillette de 11 ans après un viol, alors même que c'est en théorie légal. C'est un pays où l'accès à l'IVG est encore très restreint. On observe une forte influence de ces mouvements d'extrême droite en Amérique latine. Quelle est, votre analyse de la situation actuelle?
Gracias, Audrey. Voy a hablar en español. Los grupos, sectores de ultraderecha vienen creciendo y consolidándose en América Latina. ¿Se escucha? Can you hear it? Yeah. En los últimos años. Es bastante claro también para nosotros que esos sectores se organizan a nivel internacional, que hay una estructura de financiamiento y de difusión de ideas y de métodos y de estrategias y que hay patrones que son internacionales. Pero quería traer a esta mesa la provocación de pensar que a la vez no es lo mismo la ultraderecha en Europa que en África o en América Latina. Que esos sectores logran acoplarse a malestares que son propios de cada continente y de cada realidad social. Y no solamente eso, que su éxito, el éxito de esos sectores, se deriva de ese carácter territorial y rizomático y del diálogo que logran establecer con rencores y con miedos que son propios de cada sociedad, ¿no? Entonces, en Europa, por ejemplo, es muy clara la agenda anti-inmigración o alguna idea del multiculturalismo como una amenaza fundamental y es una discusión que así, de esa manera, no se da, por ejemplo, en América Latina. Y en ese sentido, las ultraderechas se parecen, pero no dicen ni hacen exactamente lo mismo. Y también creo que las estrategias para responder a ellas deben ser situadas, ¿no? A nivel político, institucional, electoral, que es un poco la pregunta que hiciste sobre Brasil, creo que el hito más visible que tuvimos en la región fue la elección de Jair Bolsonaro en Brasil en 2018. Es una figura que durante 30 años, que no era una figura nueva, durante 30 años en el Parlamento se posicionaba favorablemente a la dictadura militar, a la tortura, y que se presenta como líder de un sector que profundiza un rechazo a la política, que incluye obviamente una reacción a los feminismos, a los derechos LGBT, a las diversidades, pero también a los pueblos indígenas, a los militantes sin tierra, campesinos, y que básicamente se puede resumir en la búsqueda de un chivo expiatorio o chivos expiatorios para un malestar colectivo, que son los grupos históricamente subalternizados y particularmente aquellos que venían con un activismo más fuerte y más visible. Entonces, grupos que apenas empezaban a tener voz y a tener fuerza y a tener organización, son ubicados como los grupos que por tener derechos o por exigir derechos causan los problemas de la sociedad, ¿no? O son los grupos privilegiados en la línea que decíamos de cómo invertir o usar la narrativa de los derechos humanos o de las víctimas, pero al revés, ¿no? Poniendo como privilegiados a grupos que siempre fueron subalternizados, minoritarios. Bueno, en Brasil hace pocas semanas la primera vuelta electoral evidenció que Bolsonaro sigue fuerte y que su fuerza social, aún a pesar de 4 años de un gobierno muy malo, sigue fuerte y se consolidó. Porque aunque quedó en segundo lugar, tuvo 50 millones de votos que ni las encuestas detectaban y no es poco. Vamos a ver qué pasa, faltan pocos días para la segunda vuelta. Si pierde no va a ser por un margen muy alto, por una diferencia muy grande. En Colombia, de manera parecida, hubo una victoria electoral de la izquierda representada por Gustavo Petro y Francia Márquez, pero con solo 3 puntos percentuales de diferencia en relación a Rodolfo Hernández, que es un empresario con una campaña centrada, muy antipolítica, ¿no? Centrada en la corrupción de la clase política tradicional, que fue comparado a Donald Trump y obtuvo también el 47% de los votos en la segunda vuelta. En Chile, hace muy poco, se plebiscitó una nueva constitución, que es una carta de derechos avanzadísima, quizás la más avanzada a nivel mundial, y una amplísima mayoría de la sociedad votó por rechazar ese texto constituyente, después de una campaña muy exitosa de los sectores de centro a ultraderecha en Chile. Y en Argentina, que creo que es algo que se habló poco porque es más reciente, pero en las elecciones legislativas del año pasado también aparece con un buen resultado un partido de ultraderecha llamado Libertad Avanza, que no era un actor significativo y que podría crecer aún más en las elecciones del año que viene, y que además, más allá de su poder propio, también fija agenda en el sentido de ir corriendo a las derechas más tradicionales, cada vez más hacia ese discurso y esa agenda de ultraderecha, ¿no? En Argentina. Acá me habían pedido compartir la experiencia argentina de la despenalización del aborto, y la voy a compartir en la segunda mitad de la respuesta, pero lo que me dijeron de decir acá es que hoy no sería aprobado, probablemente no sería aprobado el aborto en Argentina. ¿No? Como que hubo una ventana de oportunidad en 2018 hasta 2020 que posiblemente ya se esté cerrando, pero por suerte tenemos una ley.
On en parlera effectivement plus longuement dans la deuxième partie.
Para completar, a pesar de las cuestiones más electorales e institucionales, yo creo que lo que es importante decir es que a nivel social esas fuerzas de ultraderecha están presentes y fuertes en toda América Latina, en todos los países. Yo cité algunos ejemplos, y que lo que observamos es eso. Tener como blanco fácil a los grupos LGBT, feministas, la lucha por el aborto, pero además es una fuerza que crece en un contexto de mucha fragmentación social, una desigualdad enorme, una forma del capitalismo que favorece la desagregación de los vínculos, ¿no? Una subjetividad muy egoísta, autocentrada, de modelos de desarrollo extractivistas que causan mucho daño ambiental y social, de una pauperización del sistema industrial a favor de flujos financieros y de capital, y que entonces hay un nivel de vulnerabilidad social muy grande, y que sobre ese resentimiento, esa dificultad de proyectar la vida, ¿no? De tener esperanza en una vida más digna, es que crecen esos discursos, narrativas, sectores basados en el rencor, en la búsqueda de explicaciones fáciles para tanto dolor, tanta desesperanza. Y por eso decimos que hay que pensar todo ese problema no solo en materia de género, sino de manera interseccional. No caer en el error de jerarquizar opresiones, sino pensar ese tema en la intersección de género, de clase, racial y de manera, como decía, ubicada geográficamente, históricamente. ¿No? Entonces es grave. En Argentina, por ejemplo, podemos festejar que tenemos un Ministerio de Mujeres y Géneros, pero no tenemos ningún organismo estatal sólido para proteger los derechos indígenas, ¿no? Y eso es un problema político, pero también estratégico, creemos, ¿no? Entonces, trabajar esa subjetividad y ese ambiente donde crece la ultraderecha exige entender el problema de manera más amplia y no difundir un feminismo que sea puro, elitista o blanco, en un continente como el nuestro, que es fundamentalmente indígena y negro, ¿no? Y entonces dialogar con cómo vive la mayoría de la población. Y voy a ahondar un poquito sobre eso en la segunda parte.
Merci beaucoup, Camila. Neil, brièvement, je voudrais juste revenir sur les financements russes dont vous parliez tout à l'heure, de la part d'oligarques russes, d'orthodoxes, et l'influence de Poutine dans tous ces mouvements, et en parler notamment sur la façon dont ils essayent de s'imprégner aussi en Afrique subsaharienne notamment. Est-ce que vous pourriez nous en dire deux, trois mots ?
Oui, merci. Donc, avec plaisir. Donc, dans notre rapport, on avait fait l'étude de la provenance des financements qui vont vers ces mouvements anti-genre. Et puis, la deuxième source de ces financements se trouvait être la Fédération de Russie. Et puis, bon, essayer de chercher des financements qui viennent de Russie, ce n'est pas quelque chose de très facile, mais on a pu trouver au moins certaines données qui montrent que les données sont transparentes au sein de la Fédération de Russie, qui montrent qu'il y a au moins 2 oligarques russes, Konstantin Malofeev et Vladimir Yakunin, qui ont créé ce qui s'appelle des réseaux d'influence pour socialiser les élites européennes et occidentales sur des idées pro-russes. Et donc ce sont des think tanks, des fondations, des ONG, des réseaux, etc. Et puis petit à petit, ils sont socialisés à faire penser que, essentiellement, la Russie est un pays traditionnel. Un pays traditionnel, c'est très bien. Et ce pays traditionnel est mis en opposition avec l'Occident, un Occident dégénéré.
L'Occident décadent, selon les mots du Kremlin.
Exactement, décadent, dégénéré, ou bien comme ils utilisent en anglais-russe, Gay Europa. Et donc ceci pour offrir la Russie en tant qu'alternative européenne, authentique au projet décadent de l'Union européenne qui va pervertir les mentalités authentiques européennes. Aussi, on voit cette approche qui est utilisée par la Fédération de Russie à l'échelle internationale. Donc, juste avant le Covid, en 2019, la Russie a organisé un sommet Russie-Afrique qui ressemble au sommet de beaucoup de puissance avec les pays africains, où on aborde toutes les questions, l'investissement, infrastructure, etc. Un des sujets abordés dans le sommet Russie-Afrique était une approche commune vers les valeurs traditionnelles. La Russie est un pays avec les valeurs traditionnelles, l'Afrique un continent de valeurs traditionnelles. Comment pouvons-nous nous entendre sur ces mêmes valeurs traditionnelles ? Et ceci est mis en opposition aux droits humains qui sont censés être universels. D'un côté, il y a les droits humains universels, de l'autre côté, les valeurs traditionnelles et que nous pouvons partager entre Russes et Africains. Et donc on voit, et la personne qui a été chargée de mettre en avant cette idée est le même oligarque russe, Konstantin Malofeev, qui est chargé de socialiser les élites occidentales sur ces questions. Et peut-être juste pour terminer, ce qu'on voit, c'est que c'est une tactique assez courante chez les anti-genres de de projeter les droits sexuels et les droits humains dans cette matière comme étant quelque chose d'étranger, d'alien, qui est imposé sur des cultures innocentes traditionnelles. Donc, sur l'Afrique, on peut se mettre autour de valeurs traditionnelles parce que les droits sexuels et reproductifs, ce sont des valeurs étrangères imposées par un système néocolonial. Mais en même temps, on peut utiliser le même argument, mais pas le néocolonialisme, mais on peut l'utiliser en Europe orientale. J'étais en Pologne juste hier, et donc là, l'argument néocolonial ne fonctionne pas. Mais on peut utiliser quelque chose de semblable. Donc, au lieu d'être un projet néocolonial, les droits sexuels et reproductifs, c'est pire que le nazisme et le communisme ensemble, et c'est une sorte d'Ebola imposé par Bruxelles. Donc on utilise les mêmes arguments pour montrer une prétendue source étrangère de ces droits, et puis ensuite, par une autre main, on revendique l'authenticité des valeurs traditionnelles.
Merci Neil. Ça fait écho à ce que vous nous expliquiez, Anthéa, ce que vient de dire Neil. Est-ce que vous pourriez nous expliquer un petit peu ce que vous faites au sein des Nations Unies, puisqu'aujourd'hui vous travaillez pour l'ONG Sexual Rights Initiative, qui est une coalition d'organisations nationales et régionales qui travaillent ensemble pour faire avancer les droits humains liés aux questions de sexualité aux Nations Unies. Qu'est-ce que vous observez dans le système onusien? Quelles sont les stratégies qui sont mises en place pour contrer ces mouvements anti-droit et anti-genre à Genève?
So I think Neil already spoke a lot about how practically they're working, how it's manifesting, what strategies they're using. So I will angle it a little bit different and speak a little bit about something that we haven't addressed. What these movements, what these organizations are also doing is leveraging all of the pre-existing structural issues with the international human rights system, right? So issues around access to Geneva itself, the ability of civil society organizations to go there, to get visas, to take up space, because they're well-resourced. They're Europeans, they're white, they can live in Geneva, they earn Geneva-related salaries and all this kind of stuff, which already enables their presence in this space, which is already a barrier to access for so many organizations in the global south, right? There's so many organizations that work on a range of rights that just don't have the capacity to be in these spaces where these really important negotiations are taking place. They're not there to negotiate resolutions. They're not there to negotiate draft texts. For example, the negotiations are continuing on the draft text for the rights to development convention, the legally binding text. A lot of people just don't have the capacity to be there, and these extremist actors do, right? They can afford to be there. They can deploy people to do it. Another thing they leverage is the differing ability for different kinds of states to access accurate information about things, to accurate scientific information, accurate contextual information. Because there's some diplomatic missions in Geneva, they'll have a handful of people who are supposed to cover all of the Geneva mechanisms, all of the Geneva spaces, and so they think it's their friendly neighborhood right-winger who is helping them out and offering them workshops, offering them data, saying that they'll help explain what all of these newfangled human rights terms are, but really they're being looped into a system of producing diplomats that have a very, very narrow interpretation or a non-progressive interpretation of rights. And so sometimes to kind of de-murky the waters, I don't really think of them as anti-rights actors so much as really narrow, different ideology of rights, right? So they're in these spaces to contest the ideology of universality, for a start, to contest the idea that human rights are interdependent and are not able to be put into a hierarchy. They're there to change the narratives around rights, and they find a ready audience in states that are pissed off at each other for a myriad of reasons. So in our analysis, we're already talking about how multilateralism is struggling, or how that is frayed. And actually, that context also is a breeding ground for all kinds of little extremisms, little conspiracy theories, the exchange of people's rights for clout, or to feel like you have poked at people. It's creating a context where if now we're trying to adopt the Beijing platform or like the Beijing Declaration, it just wouldn't be possible. We just could not get the consensus on that level of language. It is a race to the bottom that is facilitated by all of the political fighting, squabblings, the rhetoric around, oh, it's a clash of civilizations, and all of that kind of inflammatory content. That means that it is easy for extremists to pick off those countries that they think are weak and who may or may not have genuine grievances. So to take an example, the September session is where you have all of the development-related resolutions in the Human Rights Council. There's also a resolution on racism. There's also a resolution on water and sanitation, right? All of these, you wouldn't think sexuality and gender are going to come up. But in all of the conversations, there is an attempt to torpedo the resolution and to further contest whether or not sex or gender are legitimate terms to have in resolutions. In the water and sanitation draft resolution, there was a whole debate about whether or not we can talk about menstrual health and hygiene, okay? This isn't even the most interesting language ever, but it's because there has been the perpetuation of a narrative that states are trying to trick each other, right? If I say yes to you including health, so it's menstrual, what's usually the terminology is this menstrual hygiene, but if I say yes to you putting health here, is this really just a sneaky way of you doing X, Y, and Z? And this kind of paranoia is being fed by the operations of these right-wing groups in the space that say to states, particularly states from the global south, but other states also, all of these white people are trying to trick you with these rights language. It looks like it means X, but really, it means Y. Dun, dun, dun.
Et comment vous y répondez du coup à toutes ces stratégies et à toutes ces menaces?
It's going to sound like I'm just repeating what's been said all day, but our strategy is really radical solidarity. And we mean showing up across themes and in thematics and in places that you don't expect to see us. You will see us at water and sanitation. You will see us at racism. You will see us when we're having conversations about Palestine, because we understand that all these human rights are important, they're interrelated, and that we need to challenge all of the systems of oppression, right? We're not going to defeat the patriarchy without defeating capitalism, without defeating racism, without defeating colonialism. And so it is important to us that we also leverage our positioning as people with an office in Geneva, with people in a Geneva office to say, if you have an idea and our politics align, we're willing to roll with it and to run with it, and to ensure that in your issues, right, if you know that extremists are coming for you, they're going to come for all of us because we're all going to be there.
Camila, vous vouliez nous parler de nouveau plus en profondeur de ces mouvements évangélistes, notamment et conservateurs, qui ont une influence très forte dans la société en Amérique latine, notamment au Brésil. On a brièvement parlé du droit à l'avortement, notamment au Brésil, notamment en Argentine, qui a été permis le 30 décembre 2020, et dont on parlera peut-être un peu à la fin de cette deuxième partie d'intervention, pour voir si véritablement l'application de cette loi est correcte et complète. Quelles leçons, on voit quand même, grâce à ce qui s'est passé avec le Parlement en Argentine, que des victoires sont possibles, l'obtention du droit à l'avortement, même si vous le disiez tout à l'heure, aujourd'hui on ne pourrait pas s'en réjouir, s'en féliciter. C'est quand même une victoire. Quelles leçons est-ce qu'on peut tirer de cette victoire pour les autres pays du continent?
Sí, pensaba compartir un poquito de las estrategias que tuvimos como CELS, sabiendo que no fuimos el único actor social que trabajó por esa reforma, por la despenalización del aborto, pero contarles un poco cómo funcionó la estrategia en ese momento donde la correlación de fuerzas era un poquito mejor y que aprovechamos para lograr una ley, ¿no? Y la idea fue primero entender, analizar cuáles eran los argumentos de los sectores antiderechos, cuáles usaban más. Y a partir de ese paneo se decidió como estrategia, primero, no confrontar a los sectores de derecha, no responder a ellos, sino interpelar al Estado como garante de derechos. Y segundo, llegar y conmover a la gente que no estaba informada, que no tenía posición, pero que deseaba informarse con información confiable y que sentía que había mucha polarización y no confiaba en ninguno de los dos campos en disputa. Entonces eso como base. Después como acciones hicimos hubo un frente legal que fue desarmar argumentos que estaban impulsando los antiderechos, que decían que la Constitución argentina y el derecho internacional protegía la vida desde la concepción. Entonces armamos un documento muy claro, muy pedagógico desde el derecho internacional con la interpretación que hacíamos de la Constitución y de los tratados y distribuimos eso al Congreso, tanto diputados como senadores. Después hicimos una investigación con datos a partir de una afirmación que estaba circulando también en el sector antiderechos de que la ley, el Código Penal no se aplicaba y por lo tanto no había ninguna razón para reformarlo porque en realidad no se estaba metiendo presa a ninguna mujer y eso era falso. Entonces encontramos en distintas provincias de Argentina casos de criminalización de abortos o de eventos obstétricos para decir son tantos casos, para también traer relatos de mujeres reales y de lo que sufrieron. Entonces desarmar esa otra versión falsa de que no se aplicaba. Y después la campaña de comunicación basada en esos sectores grises, sin opinión, pero dispuestos a informarse y a formar una opinión, que era centrada en hablar de manera fácil cuál era el problema, ¿no? Y ahí yo creo que lo más interesante y el eslogan que terminamos armando era por más derechos y menos condenas. Y lo interesante es que esos sectores, si bien muchos eran religiosos, y ahí para también deconstruir un poco la idea de la religión como enemigo, necesariamente, a veces contestaban, ¿estás en contra del aborto? Y a veces te contestaban, sí, estoy en contra del aborto. Pero cuando les preguntabas, ¿pero estás a favor de que una mujer vaya presa por abortar? Y decían, no, no estoy a favor de que vaya presa, ¿no? Y ahí cuando empezás a relacionar la pregunta con que puede ser tu hermana, tu tía, tu prima, tu amiga, la persona que recurre a un aborto y si esa sanción es proporcional, bueno, la mayoría de las personas decían que no les parecía bien. Y ese fue un poco el argumento que terminó despenalizando, la idea de despenalizar el aborto en la sociedad, que es distinto del argumento de estoy a favor del aborto, ¿no? Estoy en contra de la penalización del aborto. En cuanto a la religión, también yo creo que en América Latina es compleja esa pregunta. La Iglesia Católica, por ejemplo, en América Latina tiene sectores muy progresistas. El mismo Papa hoy es un actor más bien progresista y en la discusión del aborto, si bien no estaban a favor, pero tampoco hicieron una militancia contraria ni pusieron obstáculos a la despenalización del aborto desde la Iglesia Católica. Y sobre la Iglesia Evangélica, me parece, y ahí también hablando sobre Brasil, ¿no?, muy importante separar a las iglesias como instituciones de las personas creyentes, sobre todo porque en América Latina hay un recorte de raza y de clase y que la religión tiene un rol social de contención ante la miseria, el hambre, la violencia, allí donde el Estado, ni las ONGs de derechos humanos, ni nadie llega, y que eso no lo podemos ignorar, digamos. Entonces la gente es religiosa porque la iglesia es el lugar donde pueden tener algo de contención, de alivio, de fe, de esperanza. Entonces situar a las y los evangélicos como enemigos de los derechos es alejar a una gran mayoría de la población y considerar todo el mundo como radicalizado cuando no necesariamente es el caso, ¿no? Entonces, entender realmente quiénes son los enemigos, cómo se organizan y separar, ¿no?, una cosa de la otra es importante para argumentar con más solidez y de manera más situada en la realidad y también poder acercar sectores religiosos de la defensa de derechos, ¿no? Y eso de la pregunta, ¿estás a favor del aborto? No, pero ¿estás a favor de la prisión de mujeres por aborto? Acerca a sectores creyentes que están en contra del aborto, que no lo harían, no lo defienden, pero que también pueden empatizar con la situación de una mujer y decir, la cárcel no es una pena proporcional. No debería ser penalizado, ¿no?, en todo caso. Creo que eso, como provocación y para pensar estratégicamente.
Et peut-être juste brièvement sur l'application de la loi en Argentine.
Sí, se aplica. Yo creo que las brechas quizás más importantes hoy son territoriales y relacionadas con el sistema de salud, ¿no? O sea, las mismas brechas que tiene el acceso a la salud son las que tienen las mujeres para encontrar el servicio para un aborto. Hay un tema con la accesibilidad de los medicamentos abortivos, sus precios sobre todo, y eso no tiene solo que ver con Argentina, sino con el mercado farmacéutico internacional, ¿no?, quienes fijan los precios. Y quizás un problema con la información, que quizás también tiene que ver con un momento donde la derecha está muy fuerte y una prudencia desde el Estado de salir muy claramente a decir el aborto existe, es un derecho que también afecta, digamos, la capacidad de ejercicio de las mujeres, ¿no? Como que hay creo, una elección estratégica de hacerlo silenciosamente, pero que afecta a que las mujeres realmente tengan información sobre cómo acceder.
Merci beaucoup, Camila. On va passer aux questions dans la salle. Si quelqu'un a une question, quelqu'une. Oui. Vous avez un micro juste là.
Question, a question for the gentleman. If you could provide an example, please, on what you mentioned about secularization of discourse, of the secularization of the religious discourse as a strategy. Could you please provide an example? I recall it was the second point or the second strategy that you mentioned. Thank you so much.
Yes. So you were, I'll just repeat because I'm not too sure I heard perfectly well, but you were asking about examples of the secularization of religious language. Okay. So there's many examples of this, and scholars have analyzed this and started noticing that already in the 1990s, this started with the Holy See changing the vocabulary that it uses in UN negotiations away from and stopping to use arguments based on the social doctrine of the church, and then trying to ground its arguments by selectively picking different elements of existing human rights law. But so like this, you take a look at a certain aspect of human rights law, and then you pick the bits of it, and then you cut and paste the bits that are convenient for you, and then you present this instead of the religious arguments that you have. So that's generally how it is. And then there's the manufacture of a whole range of different arguments which are not based on religion, but that then go on to point in the same direction. Just some examples of the manufacture of these types of things, which I'm more familiar with. A whole area of pseudo-health, claiming, for example, that abortion has a negative impact on women, such as post-abortion trauma. That would be one aspect. Or in terms of LGBT rights, that children raised by rainbow couples would fare less well in society. So these are secular arguments which are meant to undermine abortion rights or sexual rights without making any explicit reference to religious arguments. And you have a whole range of these. So there's the arguments there, but then there's a whole body of pseudoscience behind this, which evolves and circulates within its own silo and vacuum.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions? Oui.
Hi, thank you. I'm Shahinda from the Maldives. I just wanted to share similarities to begin with, and a question too. For example, our organization in the Maldives was the only organization working on countering violent extremism. We've been shut down after 16 years of service. We've been driven into exile. All my colleagues and myself, we are now living in exile. All of our international donors, all the state institutes, everyone have shunned us. So now we are this group of people dispersed around the world with an organization in exile, with a wealth of collective information about violent extremism in the Maldives. Maldives is the largest exporter of foreign fighters in South Asia. It is also one of the largest breeding grounds in Asia. So my question is, what do we do from here? Like, we have all this information, experience, and willingness to work, take this forward, but no avenue. So what do we do from here? Thank you.
Amparo Carvajal de Bolivia. Yo creo que estamos en un retroceso, las mujeres. Y he encontrado un camino ante este hecho de los derechos de todas nosotras, involucrando mucho más a los hombres. Si en vez de hablar tanto de la penalización de la mujer, decimos que lo que se penaliza es el encuentro de dos, eso me da resultado aún con la Iglesia Católica y con todo, porque solamente nos fijamos si es una violación o una menor o mayor, siempre esa penalización tendría que ir compartida. Gracias.
Claude Katz, ancien secrétaire général de la FIDH. J'ai une question de genre à vous poser. Je me demande effectivement pourquoi il y a si peu de défenseurs des droits des femmes masculins. Alors je précise que moi-même j'ai beaucoup plaidé sur les questions de victimes donc de harcèlement sexuel, d'agression sexuelle, de viol en tant qu'avocat. Je suis pratiquement le seul du genre masculin. Quel est pour vous le fait qu'une part du genre humain, effectivement, une part des défenseurs ne prennent pas part à ce combat, en tous les cas en intervenant effectivement, quelle est l'explication? Et d'autre part, mesdames, qu'est-ce que vous en pensez effectivement lorsque c'est un avocat, un défenseur qui intervient pour défendre les droits des femmes?
Merci. Anthéa, peut-être que vous voulez répondre à ce qu'a demandé Madame originaire des Maldives sur comment on fait pour ne pas se laisser abattre.
I don't know that I'm up to answering your question. Starting off by saying I'm really sorry that's happening to you and that it happened to your organization. And then talking about, I mean, right now we're situated in how do we use the international system, right? And just as a starting point, thinking about doing a communications to the special procedures, highlighting, doesn't even have to be the HRD ones, right? But actually focusing on the different kinds of, like, what is it that you are seeing and doing like a joint communications, for example. Thinking about how to use different slots of the Human Rights Council to really push the issues forward, to bring it to the attention of the Human Rights Council, to decide if there's some kind of mechanism that you think should happen. There are different kinds of options in terms of how we can use the Geneva system, and I will give you my business card afterwards and we can have more of a chat about it, and we can figure out what makes sense for your priorities and where we can start.
Camila, peut-être que vous voulez répondre à ce que disait Madame par rapport à l'IVG.
Que es una pregunta muy parecida me parece a la del señor. Es una pregunta delicada. Yo creo que en parte hay hoy menos, creo que no fue así históricamente, pero hoy hay menos varones defendiendo los derechos de las mujeres porque hay más mujeres defendiendo sus propios derechos y que eso es un fin en sí mismo. No ser defendidas, sino tener nuestras propias organizaciones, nuestras propias abogadas, y hacer ver que no necesitamos ser defendidas, sino que al revés somos un sector poderoso, y ocupar esos espacios. Sí creo que es importante que el feminismo sea un problema de toda la sociedad, ¿no? Y que los hombres y todas las personas estén preocupadas de los derechos de las mujeres y de las diversidades, y entiendan en qué pueden aportar a esa lucha.
I also just want to jump in on what Camila was saying. So that, and I think there is also a question on where men want to advocate for women, right? I think it's different if men are feministing and advocating for women in spaces that we still don't have access to, that we still don't get to be in. That's great. I think I have questions around wanting to occupy the space that women are already organizing in and already making the arguments in, right? So I think it's great if men are being a vanguard in those masculinist spaces that we haven't yet managed to breach, right? So maybe it's having conversations with other men about sexual violence, or talking to men about challenging their patriarchal assumptions, all these kinds of things that then takes off the burden from women in spaces that we're not in.
Merci beaucoup, Anthéa. Neil, un mot pour conclure?
Oui, je devrais peut-être dire quelque chose. Puisque la question était à propos de l'application des hommes sur ces questions, je devrais peut-être dire quelque chose. Je sais que quand j'ai commencé à travailler dans ce domaine, c'est il y a à peu près 20 ans, ma patronne à l'époque, elle m'avait dit « Ah, Neil, c'est très bien que tu nous rejoignes, tu es comme un panda, une espèce très très rare et qu'on va essayer de protéger. » Et donc c'était très mignon. Mais je crois que depuis 20 ans, il y a eu, je crois que le programme de reproduction des pandas, ça a bien marché. Et je trouve qu'il y a davantage d'hommes impliqués dans ces questions qu'il n'y avait au moins il y a 20 ans. Et moi-même, dans mon bureau, on est à parité, et on est entre hommes et femmes, et je crois qu'on est parmi les seules organisations qui travaillent dans cette question de droits des femmes, droits humains, où on a vraiment un genre de parité entre hommes et femmes. Et ce que je trouve très intéressant, c'est que l'implication des hommes et des femmes est différente. Les hommes qui sont venus travailler sur ces questions-là, pour eux, c'est vraiment comment peuvent-ils contribuer pour forger une meilleure société dans laquelle nous pouvons tous vivre. Donc les liens avec la démocratie, les droits fondamentaux, la justice dans la société, c'est ça qui les motive. Et nous voyons maintenant qu'ils sont davantage impliqués sur cette base-là, et ce inclut sur les questions de violence, les violences basées sur le genre, les violences aux femmes.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à vous d'être venu ici pour nous parler de tous ces combats.